Whether you're a self-taught musician, have a teacher, or you're already a professional, this show is meant to help you with knowledge, mindset, craft, and strategies to improve your overall musicianship so that you can become the best musician you can be, regardless of your goals. Welcome to Musicianship Mastery. Hello and welcome back. My name is David Lane and this is episode number 127. I have a fun conversation that I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. We're going to be talking with Doug Meinert. Doug spent more than 30 years in the theme park industry, and he offers quite a variety of experience to share that he had as a composer, as an arranger, as a music director, and also as an executive. He has had full-time posts at Cedar Point, Busch Gardens, Sesame Place, and SeaWorld. Just a very few places you might have also been to and heard his music that he's composed. This is a very small sample out of a very large list, but those would also include Silver Dollar City, Dollywood, Hersey Park, and Princess Cruise Lines. In 2020, he was commissioned to finish the score for The Musical Comedy Man, which was an unfinished musical by the late, great George M. Cohan. He also wrote the theme for Virginia Voices, which was featured on NPR, and his compilation known as America Fife and Drum has been featured in several movies, TV shows, and documentaries all around the world. Now, I'm excited for multiple reasons to share this conversation. And the first one, of course, is just it just sounds so fun, and it is fun, as you imagine, when you hear Doug talk about working in a theme park, being around a lot of people, both the employees, but also the people who are there to have a good time. So it's a fun environment with which to be a professional musician. But we also talk about all of the tools that he needed for this job to be successful in composition and arranging, in leading rehearsals, and also the non-musical skills that he had to develop, such as leadership, and eventually, when he became vice president, executive skills. I love his thoughts on practicing as a composer. Take note of his answer when I ask what it is that he did to get better at sketching with a pencil, to get quicker because he had so much music to write. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Doug Meinert. Doug, it is great to talk with you for what I think is the first time in about 25 years. I don't even know if you remember, but our mutual friend, Andrew Callow, gave me your name when I was fresh out of school, and I think I had gone to either Six Flags or Disney World or somewhere like that, and was in I was at a roller coaster simulation, and I was just noticing, well, the score sounded like John Williams. It sounded like this amazing score. And I was talking to Andrew, and he said, you should talk to Doug Meinert, just to know everything there is about theme parks. So we had a conversation which was helpful, and to the extent that it wasn't quite what I was looking for at that time, but I had no idea that I was going to get into musical theater for the first time like 10 years later. And it got me thinking back about how you've had kind of a career that has touched scoring, original composition, but also musical theater. So I guess, sorry, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Nice to talk to you again.
Yeah.
The great thing about this business, not just the music business, but in my case, the theme park business, is that you make great friends and you make great connections. And, the phone rings and it's a friend of a friend or somebody you worked with 15 years ago, but unfailingly kind and helpful people. And that's what I love about it. I like those little surprises. So this is a lot of fun.
So getting into the theme park business, I'm going to make a big presumption here and look like probably look like a fool if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume that when you were in high school, maybe even in college, it didn't cross your mind that this was going to be your career path and that something happened to lead you that way. Would that be correct?
That is absolutely correct.
So
But
tell us what were your youthful musical dreams, and how did that um, what's the word I'm looking for? How did that branch off to lead you down the fork you ended up going down?
sure. So I had a violin in my hands at the age of 4,
Hmm.
little quarter size violin that I had up until a year ago. I donated it to some folks. And the reason for that was my dad was a professional French horn player and music teacher. He had started his career in a teeny tiny town in northwestern Pennsylvania, playing in every little town band celebration, and also had a jazz trio at the time, playing cornet, which was booked frequently. And at the age of 18, he got permission from his mom and dad to enlist in the United States Navy in World War II. And so off he goes to the School of Music, Navy School of Music, and he's got a great gig. He's in Washington, D.C., and he's playing on the air. He's playing with people who later became, famously well known, like Albert Tipton, the world class flutist. And it's just this is a gig for a young player.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ended up going to officers candidate school, and he came out of Columbia University's 90-day program and got assigned to a destroyer escort. And the short part of the story is this Navy band musician became the senior surviving officer of the last ship torpedoed in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Wow.
In fact, you can see him over my shoulder there. There's Dad, young ensign.
Hmm.
Life-changing at the age of 22. At that point, he'd only been in the Navy 2 years. Had given up the music side of things because his country needed him. And so I would say he got out, finished his master's at Columbia, jumped into the professional music scene in New York, rubbing elbows with people like Bill Bell, the tuba player. He's on faculty with Bill Bell.
Hmm.
William Vacchiano would show up on, all of these great New York players. He and Vincent Bach,
Hmm.
Bach and brass was a friend. And so my life was all music from the very beginning. And there was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to get into music somehow, but I wasn't sure what the path would be.
Right.
And so I was at DePaul University as a music performance major, studying with Bob Grocock, who would come out of the Chicago Symphony, and Eastman School of Music, Rochester Fell, a bunch of other places. And, to be a performance major, first you have to get in. And then your sophomore year, you have to prove you can do it. Your junior year, you have to give a recital. And then your senior year, you have to give a recital. So it was very intense. But I loved it. Still have my box grad. It was just great fun. And one day, somebody said, hey, there's this amusement park called Cedar Point. Now I'm in Indiana, Ohio's not far away. And I said, okay. And they said, there's an audition, but we don't have a way to get there. And you've got a car. And I did. I had a beautiful 64 Ford Fairlane. And I said, okay, I'll drive you. So I packed up my trumpet and off we went. And we auditioned for Cedar Point. The auditions were conducted by Ohio State University, the Ohio State University alumni who's a euphonium player, which is what eventually got me into tubas and tuba quartets, and an old vaudevillian by the name of Charles Meeker, who was everything about show business. And this guy had the contract to crank out these shows, which were all period, turn of the century, big band, swing, traditional jazz, barbershop, brass and percussion on the streets. And I got the trumpet gig. So for 2 years, I played trumpet in the bands, in stage bands, musical theater.
Hmm.
And this is one of the first times I thought, I like this combination of live music and performers. That's kind of fun. I grew up around New York, so I'd seen a lot of Broadway and off Broadway growing up. And then I started to do little pencil sketch arrangements when they needed stuff done. And the next thing you know, I ended up with a full-time job on staff as staff arranger composer in the fall of 1978. And I have worked one way or the other in the theme park business every day since. So I consider myself very lucky.
So you just kind of you just mentioned something that I want to go ahead and follow up on right away. You said you did a pencil sketch arrangement. What kind of experience did you have with arranging or composing before then? Was it something that you felt prepared for, or were you really just trying things on the fly?
Yes, yes, and no. I think Dad took out my first copyrighted work when I was maybe 10 years old, 10 or 11. I was writing songs and lyrics. And I started to listen to the horn bands like Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And I mean, Chuck Findlay I grew up in Scarsdale, New York. He had a studio right in town. I never got to meet him, but I'm like, oh, that's brass sound. How does that work? And one day I'm listening to a Buddy Rich album. I think it's Buddy Rich Live at Caesars. And I'm sitting there in the living room like, okay, it's jazz, but they're not making all that up at the same time. It all goes together. How does that work? I'm just a kid.
Mhm.
I'd started to fool around with it a little bit. And then when I got into college, I started to write what I called classical brass stuff for my recitals and so forth.
Mhm.
Took composition, of course, studied arranging, of course, and then always had bands that we were knocking stuff out for, whether it was a horn band or it was a traditional jazz band or whatever it was. And so when I saw that the first time it happened, there was a great arranger that contracted in from Columbus. I think his name was Del Gittinger, and he was really good. He was solid. Um, and there was a transition that needed to be changed, which happens, trust me, all the time. You think it's done, and then a choreographer or director needs something. And I said, well, I can do that. So I just, grabbed the score and started fixing little things. Then I started doing grounds band work. We had a hobo band there, which was all comic brass and percussion, and a Keystone Cop band, which was the same thing. And then I started doing the horn band work for stage shows, and they realized that there was so much writing to be done. And about that time, they were about getting ready to buy a second park, that it just turned into right place, right time.
In kind of getting your skills ready to the point that you could do this,
Mhm.
are there some things that you did as a student that came in handy? Yeah, I'm just kind of throwing out some things that I know other composers have done, such as finding written scores and doing studies, and then sometimes listening and trying to transcribe what you hear.
Mhm.
Are the things, because especially I'm thinking in terms of getting that more polished jazz and commercial side of things, which a lot of conservatories, more now,
Mhm.
but still not a lot of them teach that side of it. They teach you the classical training, but if you want like the jazz and more commercial, a lot of times you have to have a special mentor for that, or you have to go about listening to music in a certain way and transcribing. So like what are some things that you did that helped you feel more comfortable, or was it just being around your dad who had similar experience?
Well, I think a lot came from my dad, although he was a professional horn player, but I was never in studio with him. In other words, we
Mhm.
never did the things that a teacher and a kid would do growing up. That didn't come until I got to college, and it was pretty intense, and I had some catching up to do. But
Mhm.
what I would say is the best thing to do is to find somebody you can ask questions.
Mhm.
I had a great arranging teacher by the name of John Sachs. Um, I have never heard a player. I mean, the guy was Phil Woods, and on clarinet, he was just pick one, and he could play anything. He could solo for days, classical, jazz. He was playing the last of the big band circuit up in Chicago, and I doubled on bass. And there was, which I found out in life, the world needs a lot more bass players who can read than trumpet players. So he'd take me out on a gig like with Les Elgart, the last guy standing in the big band era, and I would watch what everybody was doing, and I'd pay attention to the charts.
Mhm.
And then when I had a question, he and I'd sit down, and I was for credit, it was one of my classes. And then I just started writing, and what I found was the more I wrote, the more I learned. And I wrote a lot of things that didn't work. I wrote a marching band thing once, and the thing about marching in Indiana is that it's either going to be sleeting or hail or a thunderstorm. That's really the three things you get.
Mhm.
And so I'd written this chart. It was an original piece for it. It was a crossfield, which I like because you get all the, it's drum corps, you get all the horns in your face. And it was a miserable day, and all of that is all pre-finale, right? It was all Ditto Masters. Remember those? They smelled great when you pumped the crank, but
Right.
they weren't waterproof. And so we're out there, and everybody's parts are running, and it was a total disaster. But I had a fantastic band director by the name of Dan Hanna, who's a former Indiana Bandmasters president. I mean, he was the real deal. And he sat me down and we just went through the chart, and ever encouraging, gave me three or four simple things to try for the next time. And sure enough, that was what worked. So I learned I learned a lot in college about writing, and I used some of the original pieces to fulfill my graduation requirements as a performance major. But I will say, when I got full time that first year and you're realizing how much you have to crank out and people are showing up in a week. My
Hmm.
first tuba quartet I wrote overnight the night before we started rehearsal. That was that kind of thing. And you learn what works and you learn what doesn't work. And then, you keep going. But I'd say the big thing is find somebody you can hang out with and ask questions or get to know.
Yeah. So I know at least a decent portion of your career, your early career, was in like the pencil sketch days. I don't think finale probably wasn't like a big thing, and Sibelius obviously not quite when you first got started.
Right.
So I'm very interested to know, because I think this is still applicable even in a world of notation. What are some tips, maybe a couple, that you developed to get some speed, to be efficient in your work?
Great question. I um I got my first manuscript pen from my dad who showed me how to hold it. There's a special nib you need, and you have to hold it a certain way to get the lines so that you can go fast. And I took that manuscript pen with me to college. I didn't use it much. It was mostly, pencil at that point. But when I got to Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, I mean, I used it at Cedar Point too. I used pen and ink to draft scores. When I got to Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, all the band work that I did, aside from the show scores for the big musical productions, I did first draft, last draft in ink. So I used a really narrow point. I created my own manuscript template, and I realized that if I was going to meet my deadlines, I simply had to go. And it did two things for me. One, the more you write, the clearer your manuscript gets. It takes practice. And the second thing was that it taught me to think quickly. So, when you're writing and you've got three or four or five or six choices, do I put a key change here? Who's going to get the melody? How's this going to work? When you don't have time to stew about that, you find that you can get pretty quick, pretty fast. And then I had a copyist who was copying in ink. You're passing the parts over, and she's knocking them out. And her manuscript was gorgeous. I mean, just beautiful. So I'd say get to know your instrument. Whatever you're going to write with, know it so you forget about it. It's like when you're playing your horn and it disappears. It's just you're playing music. You're not worried about the etudes and the scales and all that. Get really familiar with it. And I did a lot of work in pencil. That symphonic suite that I sent you this morning,
Hmm.
that 70-piece orchestra in Nashville RCA Studio A. First call, everybody. What you're listening to there is probably the second take. I mean, they can read anything. That was the last big score I did all in pencil.
Was
And
that
then,
Apollo?
yeah, Apollo. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it was for a roller coaster project. And it, I, I guess I chickened out because I'd used Finale for a simulator project a few years before, but Finale in early days was, you know, it was a chore. And you
Hmm.
had a little Mac screen this big, these little Mac 2CXs, and it crashed all the time. I thought, I can't risk this. So full manuscript, sent it off to Nashville to the music preparation people, and they did a beautiful job. And after that, I would just hold my breath and use Finale for everything. And I got so fast with Finale that it was like, you see keypad entry for people, court stenographers or people using an adding machine. And I could just fly, with keypad and a tiny little keyboard this big. Just get to know your instrument, whatever your writing instrument is, get to know it well.
Nice. Um, let's pivot to other aspects of your job because, well, I should say your job over the years. You've picked up a lot of tools, so obviously composing and arranging is a big part. But so is music production skills because I know you've done some things in the studio.
Mhm.
And so, what are some things that you have learned over the years that have become valuable for just working in a studio and recording your music?
Before you book the session, make sure the charts are done and proofed. And fortunately, I didn't have to learn that the hard way, but I was on such budgets. The good news was we had a lot of money to spend. We had good budgets, big companies. The bad news was you didn't get a second chance.
Mm.
So we would get the parts all copied, laid out, and we would sit around a giant table and we would proof for 2 days every part. So that when we got in the studio, particularly Omega Recording up in Washington, D.C. And I had members of the National Symphony, the Marine Band, the Navy Band, Coast Guard, Air Force, had them all. They were so happy to get clean parts that had been proofed that the sessions went remarkably well. That's my best advice. Go into the studio prepared, because I don't care if it's a big studio or a little studio. You're going to have the same problem if you show up and, it's not the Beatles. They're not sitting around with George Martin hashing things out at Abbey Road. It's like, this is a business. This is a job. You need to go in. You need to have done your homework. And if something doesn't work, you need to know how to fix it. If somebody doesn't show up, for example, that happens at sessions. So be flexible, but go in as prepared as you possibly can.
Something our mutual friend Andrew, I don't know if I heard it from him or if I was in the room with him when we heard it from someone else, but it almost sounds like, based on what I've heard you say, that it might have come from you possibly, but said professionals in a session, like if you're presenting new music,
Mhm,
they'll give you one mistake.
mhm,
But if you have a second, they start judging you.
mhm,
And it's one of those, you might be very good at what you do, but the the way you present it and the time that you take to proof it shows the degree of professionalism
mhm,
or the lack of professionalism, and
mhm.
that's what they judge. And and fairly or unfairly, your overall musicianship gets lumped into all that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Nice. Let's pivot to your role as a music director. And now, I want to just kind of summarize what my job description has been in music directing shows, and you can tell me like what's the same or what's different about it. So, as a music director, of course, I've made decisions about the production, been responsible hiring the musicians if there wasn't a contractor,
Mhm,
and making any kind of fine adjustments to the arrangements. But also, I've taught the cast their vocal parts, rehearsed with them at the piano, and then when the when it shifts to production mode, I've either played at the piano while head nodding with the musicians or the keyboard. Sometimes had to program the keyboard, and or I've conducted the orchestra. So is is that similar to what you've done, or is there something I left out, or something you haven't done out of that list?
No, I think all of the above. It depends on who your team is.
Right.
I learned a long time ago that if I can find somebody who does something better than me, then I get them.
Yeah.
And I can teach vocal parts, and I can tell people what I want. Uh, there are people who are much better vocal coaches than I am. And so, while that was part of what I did, most of the time I had a separate vocal specialist who was rehearsing the singers, and I would be working with the band, and then I'd come in to see how it was going, and then eventually we'd put it all together. In musical theater, sometimes that step is called sitz probe, where you all sit down together and you read through it, you see what you got. Um, so that certainly, yeah, waving your arms for all of the above. Sometimes you're the conductor as well. I did a lot of hours banging on the piano with singers, and then bringing in the rhythm section. And at the big parks, you've got two or three shows going at the same time, so you can't do them all yourself. So you got, excuse me, you get a lot of experience, and the toolkit. And I love, by the way, your idea that you got to have these toolkits. Uh,
Mhm.
once again, can be anything. It can be, to your point, you have to program the keyboard, you have to fix something in a chart. You find out somebody has a range problem, a vocalist, or she's got a break in an unfortunate place, and you just adjust and figure it all out.
Um, Thinking about maybe a show that you've done for a theme park from scratch. What's the timeline from first rehearsal to opening night? How much time do you get? How much rehearsal time per week do you spend?
Yeah, so it depends. The big stage shows that have special effects and lighting and big costumes and all that, they're multi-year projects because you have to present the concepts. do sketches, get the funding approval. Big companies have yearly budgets. So you're out 2 years thinking about it. From the time you get somebody to rehearse to the time you go on stage with a big stage show in a big park is probably 4 weeks.
Mhm.
Probably 4 weeks. Cedar Point, because we did everything quick and the shows were smaller, it was all live. We'd start rehearsing on a Monday and we would dress Friday night
Wow.
and we would open Saturday. It was old school, and I learned so much from that. And I learned so much because the audiences were so close in those theaters. You learned how to read an audience and what worked and what didn't, which by the way is what I'm all about. I think every show is a story. I've got 2 or 3 composition students right now, and we spend a lot of time on structuring story.
Hmm.
And I
Now,
frequently find myself saying, "Hey, that sounds great. Where are you
does
going
that
with
I'm sorry, is that timeline, was that for the instrumentalists or is that for vocalists? For the
Well, usually the vocalists, you start with the vocalists because they have to learn choreography too. So they'd start a month out and then we would bring the band in 10 days before.
right.
And the reason we had to have a little more time was because the bands were going to be on stage and they had to synchronize with all of the other stuff that was going on.
Nice. What is at least one tool that you would say you had to develop on the job that you weren't expecting in advance?
Well, I didn't expect to be a senior executive in a Fortune 100 company.
Mm.
There was that. Um, I learned that I liked business and I liked the business of show business. But those skills, I had some great instructors along the way. Those things you just have to learn as you go. And it was true of a lot of people in the parks. The person who is an expert in zoological doesn't have a finance background. The person who's an expert in food service or rides, they don't, you're all learning at the same time frequently. I would say the thing that I kept in my back pocket, um, in terms of what you might not have thought that you had to have when I first started out, to be perfectly honest, is a sense of humor
Mhm.
and a sense of humility about your work. And I know that's not the technical answer you're looking for, but let me go with this for a minute. If you're teaching a student, it's not about you, it's about the student, right?
Mhm.
If um, it's for a performance, whatever you wrote still isn't about you. It's about the audience, right? That's who you're doing it for. And if it's client, if it's commercial, it's still not about you. It's about the client. So this role we play as composers, which some people think they understand, and arrangers, which nobody understands, right? You
Right.
have to get confidence and satisfaction out of the fact that nobody will really understand what you do. And sometimes that takes humility, humor, so that you keep your perspective as you're working with all these people. Because at the end of the day, especially a big stage show, musical theater is about lots of people with different disciplines from different backgrounds. And it's all about getting those people to work together.
Excellent. The next question I had on my notes was going to be any advice you would offer to aspiring musicians, but I feel like you just did. Get a sense of humor and keep it. But is there anything else that you would offer just as a blanket statement to aspiring musicians? I guess especially, I mean, you've watched the world change, the landscape of music has changed probably a lot, multiple times, but
Yeah.
especially like in 2025, what's one thing you would tell musicians?
Yeah. I think the thing that I would tell musicians is not to assume where you think you're headed is where you're going to end up. I had no idea, but I saw a door open and I realized I really liked where I was. I liked the people. I liked watching families come through the park. I loved it. At that point, the repertoire was all Great American Songbook. That's what I grew up with. And that followed me through my entire career. I would see those opportunities. I thought I would probably end up, I know I wasn't going to be a symphony player, but, I graduated the performance diploma. So there were some jobs I could have had. I'm sure. My goal was to probably go out and get some experience. My dad asked me once, "Do you want to teach?" And it was because I'd said to him, "Do you think I should get a music ed degree or or should I get a performance degree? And he said, well, do you want to teach? And his point was, I mean, my dad taught for 40 some years in New York school systems, You teach
Mhm.
because you want to teach, not because you want to do something else. And I said, well, my best teachers in college had stories to tell about when they used to perform. And he said, get the performance degree. And I always remember this. He said, let's just see what happens. This guy with his worldly view, World War II guy, he said, let's just see what happens. And sure enough, all these things opened up from, I think, just following your heart and doing what you wanted to do, but knowing it might take you someplace slightly different.
Mhm. I feel like if people could just say, let's just see what happens, that would be a solution for a lot of situations, I think.
Yes.
So that's great advice.
Because we try so hard to make things happen.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always work that way. I would say this about 2025. No kidding. There are performance opportunities that just didn't exist. I mean, the cruise line thing was kinda, but now it's huge. These big production shows on big ships and little ships and um, immersive entertainment experiences that cross the fourth wall and somehow you're in the middle of things and you've got all this different kind of technical media going on. And touring shows. I mean, the Broadway touring shows are really phenomenal. That scene just didn't exist. Um, and so I would just encourage people to look for those opportunities. And whatever job you're on, and I learned this from studying people who made it, they were household names. No matter how small a job, no matter the quality of the performers or the musicians, you treat them with respect because everybody's on that stage for a reason. And you give every bit as much. I mean, no kidding, little tiny shows in the middle of nowhere. I'd see these people give every bit, every ounce of their attention to that show that they would if they were in New York working on a big production. Because that's integrity. That's what everybody deserves when you're trying to pull a show together.
Wonderful. Well, I know to dive into your career properly would take a series of episodes. We wouldn't be able to do it in a single episode.
And
But I thought we could highlight a little bit of what you did, and I feel like we did that. So, where can people follow you, find out more about you?
yeah. So, I have an LLC, like as we mostly all do, and it's called Minder Music Works. And there's a website that has a lot of the same information that you've got in front of me. Um, they certainly can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty quiet on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's interesting. Most of my contacts on LinkedIn consider me to be an entertainment executive, which it's an interesting place to be. Although a lot of my music buddies are there too, but it's that space. But they certainly can follow me on LinkedIn, and that's easy. And I also encourage people, if they go to my website, there's a contact way to get in touch with me. And I work with all kinds of composers and young producers and anybody who's in the biz who needs somebody to talk to. I have a young woman right now. We've worked for 2 years together. Absolute genius of a young woman. Uh, Degree in mathematics from a really good school. But she is a wonderful contemporary writer of musical theater. And after a lot of ups and downs and sticking with it the way you have to, she's got a show going on stage off Broadway at a festival this coming weekend.
Mhm.
Those to me are the wins when you can get involved like that. I've got some great composition students. Some of them are young, some of them not. Some of them are retired military, but still young, military band from West Point or from the Navy or from wherever. I've got some young producers who've opened great studios. I enjoy doing that kind of work. So I encourage them to reach out. Send me a note. The email address is very simple, dougminard@gmail.com.
Well, excellent. It's been great talking to you. Hopefully, maybe not 25 years before the next time.
That's so funny, but that's the way it works. And sometimes, you run into people from 20 years ago and you say, what were we talking about? And you
Right.
carry on. But this is a pleasure. It's been a real delight and always love to talk shop.
And that's just about going to wrap up today's episode. If you have any thoughts on this episode, if you'd like to send them in in the form of an email, you can do so by going to my website at davidlanemusic.com and use the contact form, or you can use your own voice by going to speakpipe.com/musician toolkit. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back with you again next week.